Good evening, y'all. This is Dan here with the Hemp Highway of Kentucky, bringing you another episode of Hemp Threads, Weaving an Industry Season 2. And this show, we got something special because I haven't really taken a dive into the legal ramifications and legal questions surrounding cannabis and hemp. And I'm delighted to have an attorney today and fellow Grateful Dead fan, Pamela Wexler. How you doing, Pamela?
I'm great. Thanks, Dan. How you doing?
I'm very good, and thank you for appearing on the show. I think it's funny, we didn't really connect over cannabis initially. I think it was a Grateful Dead tagline on my LinkedIn bio, and it just kind of grew from there. It's kind of cool the way that works.
Yeah, I mentioned to someone I was doing a podcast on hemp. They were like, how'd you find him? Like, he had test me. Why don't you arrest me? As tagline, I was like, I gotta connect with that guy. And didn't even know your name for a long time when you were still masquerading as Hemp Highway, and right. So you were one of the first people that I connected with on LinkedIn. So
that's so cool. So yeah. I'm going to jump right in here because I think what's going on in the cannabis and hemp, and I hate calling them two separate industries because it's the same damn plant biologically. But I want to jump into a legal question right off the bat, because there's a lot of debate. Can you briefly, or not necessarily briefly, but concisely summarize the difference between legalization and decriminalization and descheduling versus rescheduling? These are all sort of terms that we throw around, and I don't necessarily know if everybody understands them.
Yeah, I think part of it is different states operate differently. And so we take a terminology and we use it interchangeably, and they can mean different things in different places. So that's the first thing. It's not necessarily easy to describe, to explain. But generally, when you think of the idea of decriminalizing, it simply means to remove the criminalization aspect of it, stop locking people up. How's that happen? Okay, so cannabis is regulated after 1970 by the Controlled Substances Act, a federal legal arrangement that created schedules, meaning Schedule 1, 2, 3, and 4, and drugs are classified on different schedules based on 3 aspects. And I did write that down somewhere, but their ability to have any useful, I did write it down. There are 3 aspects of scheduling. And cannabis sits on Schedule 1, no medical value and high potential for addiction and harm. So every drug is scheduled, and its ability to be used, tested, prescribed is based on those schedules. Schedule 1 drugs are fully illegal. So if cannabis were to be changed federally, it would require either being removed from the Controlled Substances Act altogether and not scheduled. So when you hear people talking about descheduling, it would remove the substance from the law.
That sounds like a really positive development in a sense, because it seemed, and pardon me for interjecting here, it seems like the biggest, from a perspective of a citizen who's followed this, it seems like the biggest issue is how is the government going to get some money out of it? And so descheduling eliminates their ability to regulate it in a way that they can really, in my opinion, tax it the way they want to and control access, more importantly, the way they want to.
So that's the complicated aspect that I don't think I'm doing a great job of explaining. When you decriminalize something, it leaves it open, meaning people will not be arrested for it. descheduling it or legalizing it suggests that there will be a whole set of legal rules that will come, a regulatory regime that will be developed that will have that very aspect, which is taxation, Dan, right? And so what the real question going on right now, people are calling for decriminalization, and many states decriminalized cannabis early on. And in fact, there are only, I believe, 3 states in the country where there has been no adjustment of criminalization with respect to cannabis. Only 3 states. Everywhere else, for certain quantities, penalties have been reduced, and they recognize, that putting incarcerating people for small quantities is a waste of police resources. But so, for instance, Joe Biden on his official website, whatever, is calling to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, which would allow more research and would allow more prescription, but it would not set up a taxation or a legal system to regulate. And the last point of this, and this is going on with psychedelics now, and it's really, everybody's really not sure how, and that is when you decriminalize something, but you don't institute guardrails, some kind of regime, then you have the Wild Wild West. And that is sort of some of what we're seeing with cannabis, a lot unregulated product, inability to age, THC limits. It's just this, nobody knows what's out there. And then the backlash, right? So that's what, so does that, again, it's not cut and dry, but decriminalization simply meaning people don't get locked up. And, just so to throw a figure out, because I did look at this, about 500,000 people are still arrested annually for cannabis crimes, but 80% of those are simple possession, right? Not 20, the trafficking numbers are pretty small and decreasing. And so to continually have people involved in the criminal justice system over a plant, right? We're getting there. Maybe I'll let you chime in, but I know that one of the things that I really want to make sure people are aware of is that California Senate Bill 519 passed the week before last, which is the decriminalization of all drugs other than mescaline. They left it out, but that passed in the California Senate. It's due to go to the Assembly, the California Assembly. So you're going to see that wide scale mental health harm reduction focus on the decriminalization that came out of that, started in Oregon with Measure 110, where we're really moving to seeing all drugs in one basket, and that it's really about what getting through the stigma of what these drugs can and can't do to different populations. So
this is definitely something that I would dig into on maybe a different type of thing, but the idea that they've decided everything but mescaline, which if I'm not mistaken,
it's because of the ecological pressure. And so they were responding to the indigenous population that said, please do not decriminalize people coming to our native lands and stealing what little mescaline we have. And so that the peyote and mescaline, because of the indigenous population lobby, that was, from my understanding, why certain things were excluded. But this is one of the things that you'll learn more as you talk to me. I don't learn legislation early on. I talk about it generally, because if I'm going to go and learn which drugs were excluded, whatever, there will be a conference. There will be changes in the language. There will be amendments. And so I don't, to say it is or isn't hard rule, I'm not really sure. But there is pressure from Indigenous communities with respect to.
So if I'm not mistaken, though, when you start deriving out what it is, and God, I know I shouldn't be going down this rabbit hole now, unlimited time. It's like DMT or something like that's the active component in mescaline, isn't it?
Again, that's going to escape me. DMT is ecstasy, I think.
No, that's MDMA.
Oh, that's MDMA, right? So again, each individual, mescaline is like LSD.
Right, but again, it's because I think the reason I brought up the DMT thing. God, we're going down this crazy rabbit hole. Is that there are other like aloesia has like DMT in it or something like that, and there's other substances that have the same. I mean, is it outlawing the natural occurring substance or the synthesized version in the laboratory? That was where I kind of got into.
Right, it's the natural substance. Because they don't want people foraging.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
It is simply for conservation issues. That
makes total sense. Okay, I'm going to get back to our original conversation though, because
in Washington D.C. when we did the Initiative 81, peyote was also not on there for the same reason. We didn't. It's indigenous conservation.
You didn't want a bunch of hippies running around on protected land digging up a sacred.
Exactly. I don't really know how much of it is available in this area anyway. I know that psilocybin is. I know.
Hey, all you need is the right medium in a dark space. You can grow it in your closet. I knew people that did that in college and pretty much avoided loans. So we talked a little bit about, scheduling and this stuff. One of the things that, from my perspective, it seems like happens is the DEA and the FDA have kind of like hot potato things. Like the DEA says, well, we can't change our scheduling or our this, that, and the other until the FDA says that they've got some sort of legit use. And the FDA says, well, we can't really get into that until the DEA takes the cuffs off. Is that an accurate assessment, and do you see that being resolved?
Well, I don't know if that's such an accurate assessment, but I do want to go back really quickly to one of the things you mentioned either in our pre-show or right at the beginning, and you mentioned, well, I don't really like to say that because it's one damn plant. Okay. So when I first, you don't like to say cannabis versus hemp because it's one plant, right? When I first started getting into this, and let's just start with the fact that I'm a 40 plus year participant in the clinical trial on cannabis. So I'm well versed in the use of cannabis. Never really called it cannabis, but well versed in it. And when the Farm Bill passed in 2018, a gentleman who I have done some work with, who actually was jailed for growing hemp 35 years ago in Virginia, was one of the first people to push the idea of reinvigorating the economy with hemp, and is, was personal friends with Harrer. And I didn't know any of this at the time. I just happened to know the guy. And he says they didn't know what they were doing. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, this whole 3.3% thing, Congress did not understand. It's one plant. At the time, I really did not know what my friend said. Now I understand. And my prediction is, Dan, that 40 years, 30, whatever it takes, we will look back at this time and say, can you believe that they were like making farmers burn hot hemp? Can you believe that they were trying to figure out when to measure hemp for THC content, and people were coming up with methodologies and analytics to this is for ag and this is for topical and this is for food supply, and that and they didn't understand it was one plant. Okay. And so we're going through the dismantling of a, I don't have to tell you about anything about the racial origins of the creation of prohibition. And so it's going to take us, at least half the time, I would say 30 years of 80 years of prohibition. It's going to take us 30 or 40 years to dismantle it, plus all the stigma, and to reinvigorate the research to understand what this thing does and how it can be used, this plant. At any rate, that's so coming from that Congress passes the Farm Bill and hemp's legal again, and we're going to keep it at this percentage, not having any idea how the plant is bred and what's gone on in the past 80 years and all of it. And sets up, and now there's this regulatory regime that now brings in the Department of Agriculture to regulate this illusion, this fake concept. And if we get cut off for any reason, we can just pick up another, call. I don't know if
I can edit it all together. It's all good.
But it's an illusion. It's a fiction. Hemp, 3% THC, 0.03%. Who made that up? There's no such thing. 2% in Europe someplace, 1% over here. It's one plant. So DEA thinks we're controlling THC contented plant. The Department of Agriculture is like, well, we're only going to focus on the plant that's been legalized. So after it's got this much THC, it's out of our jurisdiction. The interesting one for me is FDA. And so because I do a lot of device law and cosmetics, and you may or may not know that the Food and Drug Administration has approved one cannabis-derived CBD drug. It's called Epidiolex.
Yeah.
It was GW Pharmaceuticals, and so that's got a CBD as an active ingredient.
It's basically CBD isolate. It's like 90% CBD and like carrier oil,
which is probably why it's not, because it's not full spectrum, it's
right.
Limited. But anyway, and so they've approved it. So once FDA, and it's gone through drug trial, the process of approval, clinical trial. And once FDA approves that, once CBD is in it, it's considered an active drug ingredient, and nobody else can use it without going through the same trials. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's quite a few thousand million products out there with CBD in them that have not gone through FDA trials. Okay, so we are in this crazy world of it's been approved. FDA is holding out, and since the day the Farm Bill was went into effect, saying we have, because CBD has been approved in a drug product, we have authority over all CBD in all food, cosmetics, animal, supplement, vitamin, whatever you want to call it, we have authority over it. Well, it's almost 3 years since the Farm Bill's been passed, and FDA hasn't promulgated any rules. They did send something over for like an idea of how they would regulate it under that.
So at this point, the Zoom interview cut out because Pamela and I had talked for about 10 minutes before I started recording. So we picked up with the second Zoom meeting, and it was so engaging that we went another full half hour. So instead of trying to cut all that down, I figured that y'all might be interested in some of the stuff that we discussed in that extended version.
Yeah, so we're in this almost it's nonsensical, and everything about cannabis since I got involved has seemed pretty nonsensical from a legal standpoint. But post 2018, nonsensical situation where FDA is claiming it and it alone retains authority over CBD, but has failed to promulgate any rules. And at the same time, even when CBD was going through the formal approval process in the prescription drug Epidiolex, CBD was being put in products all around the country. And in addition to the federal regulation of food and drug, each state also duplicates that regulatory scheme. And so federally illegal to put CBD in anything in California, but the California food and regulations allow for it. Same thing in Florida. And so, but in other states like New York has modeled FDA's position, which is that you can't put it into food or beverages, but yet you can go into any bodega in New York City and buy a CBD drink. So again, we are in a nonsensical situation. One thing I will say, what FDA has done, and now you get yet another agency of federal soup to add to the picture, and that is both in July and then again in December of last year, FDA issued a series of enforcement actions against large manufacturers of CBD products, large manufacturers, $1 million interstate companies operating legally within a state where cannabis has been legalized. So FDA, in conjunction with the Federal Trade Commission, has cracked down on certain CBD companies, enforcing its authority to have these products removed from the market based on false labeling, misleading claims, saying that the companies are saying CBD cures something. So FDA, of course, because it regulates medicines, has the right to prohibit that. And because it's a labeling issue, it is also under the Federal Trade Commission because it's marketed and trade, part of the trade. And so the FTC and FDA are enforcing CBD, their right to remove CBD products in a handful of products. Like, I think 30 letters went out, and there's probably, 30,000 companies at least selling CBD. And so if you're one of the people that got unluckily nailed, you're making claims. And so there's legal ways that lawyers like me are helping companies look at what was enforced and say, well, you're at least don't do that, to stay on the right side of whatever enforcement is going on. But again, it's pretty nonsensical. And if you're a manufacturer, your best road is to comply with your state laws and to have good standard operating procedures and, comply with what you would do if it was legal. And then you keep your fingers crossed that you don't.
I think it's fascinating because you brought up the whole labeling thing. And I don't think people really understand the genesis of the FDA. It came out of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, which was enacted because people were putting excuse my language, putting things into what are called patent medicines sold by medicine men off of the back of their wagons. And there was alcohol in them and morphine and cocaine and whatever. And the idea was that you didn't necessarily have to tell people what they were putting into their body. You didn't regulate what people were putting in their bodies. They had to be informed of the ingredients, and the label had to be truthful. And that was the beginning of the FDA. And it's turned into this like multi-tentacled regulatory beast. And it's really kind of like, there's a fine line between informing people to make their best decision and being the helicopter parent of government.
Yeah, well, I think in cannabis, it's, compounded by the illegality and the stigma. So you couldn't research, you couldn't get the information. And even now, people, and, again, all of these topics are rabbit holes, but part of the reason, now, oh, let's share our information. But because we've gone to a capitalist situation, people are afraid about sharing that information. So even though you had it, you don't want to necessarily share your strains or your clinical data because you don't know how it's going to be used. I'm a lawyer. I never joined Normal because I don't know how that information is going to be used.
Right.
And then, take that times a million people using this and researchers. It's going to just take a long time to shake that out until.
I have a really good friend of mine is he's got a PhD in pharmacology, and he's done a lot of different research, and some of it, he's interested in cannabis. And one of the things he keeps coming back to is that one, Epidiolex was actually approved. In his mind, the theory was there are doctors that want to prescribe a cannabis medication, but because there's no guidelines, there's no way to really understand dosing, that having something like that where they could write a prescription and say, do this much, gave them a way to get into prescribing cannabis, but still have a safety net. And I thought that was kind of an interesting take on it, that, the doctors maybe want to do this, but they don't necessarily have the mechanism available to do it and feel like they're giving safe information and cover their ass.
I never heard it come in that way. I'm much more bombarded with the fact that doctors they learn about your circulatory system and your digestive system and your nervous system, but they don't even know that there's an endocannabinoid system. They get through medical school, they don't even realize it. I think that my experience with doctors who are interested in prescribing cannabis is that they recognize that Epidiolex is a weak option, and that I do think that people thought it was moving the needle forward as we went. Like, here's it's mainstreaming the idea of a cannabis derived product being useful, again, because it's not full spectrum. I don't really, it's not gonna support the good medical knowledge that we know is out there. That just that needs to be validated and peer reviewed. But early on, I sort of was like, is FDA going to try and bring this back in? Now the idea of pulling CBD off the market is ridiculous. But if you go on FDA's website, it still says CBD causes liver damage on the website.
I've heard some different people, because anything gets metabolized in the liver. Alcohol, cannabinoids, all that stuff gets metabolized in the liver. So the idea that it doesn't have some sort of impact, but where is it the CBD and where is it the carrier? What sort of stuff are you putting in there that's going to potentially have an impact?
That's true. I have done a little bit of research on CBD and liver toxicity. One thing I might be the tiniest bit deeper on, and believe it or not, it was a paid study from a pharmaceutical that was it was poor methodology. Like, in other words, it was layered on top of one thing, layered on top of another, that was then picked up by a major newspaper, that was then reprinted with the bad idea. And when you actually go back and look at what it is, the methodology was flawed. It was, the news releases were intended to give that, it was paid research from a university, one study, right? And then it just cascades. And so the whole idea of CBD and liver toxicity came from, giving mice 3,000 times the amount of CBD that would be a dosage in 48 hours and like, guess what? Their livers were damaged, but it
So
had
that's-
no
It's kind of
extrapolation.
like the experiments back in the 80s where they like put gas masks on monkeys and then said that like cannabis caused brain damage and asphyxiation. It's like,
Exactly.
yeah, if you force feed a monkey
Same thing.
cannabis smoke, you're going to get freaking brain damage from, you know, lack of oxygen.
There is, you know, look, there has been liver toxicity associated with CBD, but not enough to make any kind of causation. And again, like, are you giving CBD to the worst patients who already came in with their livers already in bad shape? And then your result is, oh, when you give CBD, their liver is toxic. Well, like, what were they like? What was the baseline? I don't know any of that. And so we all want to be careful, but the best evidence to me, again, is my 40-year clinical study. All right. And a lot of peers who have been in that same 40, 50-year clinical study, and they're not all dying of lung cancer. They're not, right? Same thing. People are not dropping dead from CBD. Now, again, it could be cumulative. There could be an effect over time, but these products have been in the marketplace, good tolerance for a long time. And so, again, for FDA to say we don't have enough evidence to say whether these drugs are safe or not, but to, off of one study, have on their website, CBD is toxic to your liver, it's disingenuous. We either don't know or we don't know, but
you just hit on something that really, I think people are aware of it, but they don't really kind of see the full picture. As a regulatory agency, when the FDA, the director of the FDA is named, and it's a person who was in the pharmaceutical industry, then that person's primary objective is probably going to be to protect the pharmaceutical industry's interest. And cannabis represents a threat to that because there's so many potential uses that we generally accepted as being safe. And yet they don't want to go that route because potentially they're going to cut their own, you know, earnings out.
Yeah, I have to believe that the best route for all of this is to have availability as wide as possible. Meaning, I do want to see a route for specialized drugs that treat specific conditions that are dosed and reliable. But I also want to be able to grow a plant in my backyard and say, like, wow, that really didn't do as good of a job for me as for my pain as I would have liked. I think I'm going to try and grow something different. And yet another route, which is take my blood, look at my gene markers, and tell me what kind of cannabis I should be smoking to optimize my system, right? To bring my ECS system to equilibrium across the board. This is missing. I need some of this, whatever. You know, I think there's room for all of it. I really am have spent a fair amount of time kind of trying to look at the differences between cannabis and psychedelics because they are growing in parallel. A lot of the impetus has been, you know, the AIDS and need for medical treatment and the rise of these capitalist roots in the midst of something which is natural and a plant, and like the play between that. And I guess my overall feeling, Dan, is Ruth's Chris does not want to shut McDonald's down, nor does Ruth's Chris want to prevent you from going to the supermarket and buying a good cut of steak, marinated and a half. They have their experience. This is for people who want to go out and have their experience, but we're not trying to stop all other people from creating steak products or any other kind of beef or something that is like beef, but might be easier to chew, or maybe a smaller amount or a different cut that we don't offer, right? That same thing. sometimes you just want a quick burger. Sometimes you want it with it, right? And sometimes you want to cook it yourself. And so if cannabis is to be truly legal, it needs to be just like any other plant. Not everybody. I don't grow, right? I live in a condo in the middle of the city. I buy all of my tomatoes. But if I wanted to grow a tomato, I would like the pastos. Same thing with cannabis. And I feel like there is room for a pharmaceutical company to need to develop a dosed specific mixture of something that brings real targeted health. But because FDA's drug development process is so expensive, that is why they want to block other people out, because they want to be able to receive them, the rights. And that,
that I'm sorry to interject, but that totally
only US is my interject, right? That's a
well, my friends, my friend who's in the pharmacology thing, the other thing he brings up is that really there's no intellectual property to protect. Like when they put the studies out there that this is what the benefits are, there's nothing to prevent a person, except for like laws that prevent home grows, from buying that seed strain and doing it in their backyard, as opposed to making it part of the capitalist system. And
right.
that's a big thing, if you can't monetize it, then it becomes difficult to even do the research, because why do you want to do the research on something you can't monetize?
Exactly. And so that is really what is at heart in the psychedelics going on right now, is because, like, just take MDMA molecule, which is not patentable, right? It's in the public domain. And so what company, and MAPS right now, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies out in San Francisco, has the FDA fast track authority to develop MDMA. And they just finished, that's why that big New York Times article came out about a month ago. And the phase 3 clinical trial data just came through. And I think they had like close to 70% of vets reporting no symptoms after one MDMA treatment in 6 months. So the numbers are like insane on the phase 3 clinical, which is why Rick Doblin and those guys are just, but what FDA gave them was a 5-year monopoly, or 3 or 5 monopoly on the substance once it is approved. And so that will give them a chance to make up some of that, to be able to give access, because MAPS is a nonprofit. But
I remember when he started it back in the 90s, because that's when I was doing all my research into High Times magazine, and all of a sudden this guy Rick Doblin pops up and he tells this story about, like, he was listening to The Wall or something like that when he was tripping, and he hears the air raid siren go off, and he like has this moment like the world's gonna end, and then he realizes he's listening to a record, and he had this like spiritual rebirth, and he's like, then the light bulbs went off, and I was like, wow, that's a really cool concept. And to see that 30 years later he's turned it into something that's really at the forefront of research, it's absolutely amazing.
It's amazing. I know again, this is off our topic, but in, the difference in cannabis and psychedelics is so stark to me. And why is because of a couple of old white men, seriously, a very, like a limited number of people they were at Spring Grove, but now that's Hopkins. They were outside of Baltimore, a couple of people at UCLA, Rick Doblin. And when the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, cannabis was not being researched, but psychedelics was. And those people went underground, but because they were so well respected, they kept federal research dollars quietly hidden, like into the 80s, because of the alcohol LSD and alcoholism. And that research kind of stayed underground quietly. And I'll just tell you really quick personal anecdote. I grew up in the suburbs of Baltimore. And later, when I read Michael Pollan's book, I realized what I had seen as a child. There was an old mental hospital, mental facility, right? Where in the 70s, they started pushing people out of these facilities, right? And we would drive by, and it was big, and it was like an old Gothic castle, and it would have lights on, and it was Spring Grove Hospital. And that is what stayed after all the patients were gone. It was the psychedelic alcoholic researchers. That's why the lights were still on at Spring Grove. So when I was like 14, 15, I was learning to drive and being out, we would go in the back out and we'd go past Spring Grove Hospital and there would be lights and we would always be freaky. What the hell is anybody doing there? Now I know. They were tripping in the basement. But that research, unlike cannabis, is what I'm saying, is that the psychedelic went underground, and that is why Rick had, and I mean, there were just so many people who felt that this could not go away and that so much had been done.
Yeah, and let's bring up the insidious dark side of that, because so much of the original research into psychedelics was part of MK Ultra, which was ultimately to come up with ways to brainwash and control people. But it grew the legitimate altruistic research, and guys like Leary were doing that back in the 50s and stuff like that as part of funded by MK Ultra, and they just kind of took it somewhere else. So obviously there was still, I don't think the money was going towards that insidious thing, but that's kind of the origins of the whole government research in psychedelics thing.
One thinks, but then, there's like any other onion. There are people that say that that was like an op, that there was an op under that, and that MK Ultra was, born, and that what's his name, that Hoffman was in on it, and he knew that it was, like I've heard, and there are a couple of, again, white men who, have been doing, like the elders of the psychedelic movement, who are, really questioning now this resurgence, right? They've now gone full circle, and now they are against what is going on with MAPS, and they don't want it to happen because of what you just said. Is it started out as a way to control, and where is it going? Is that's exactly where, in other words, the whole idea of like going on your trip and coming back and one love and whatever, it's all great, except if you're still coming back to that corrupt capitalist system, then, right? Then what you have to do is you have to make one love with the oppression. And so basically you're not going to be a fighter and change things. You're going to come, if the system is still the way it is, now you're going to have all the mental health benefits of, reprogramming your mind to be able to come back and say, well, this is the way it is. And so those people are showing like psychedelics is not the answer. So there's a lot of backlash against psychedelic evangelism. Very different, people don't, you don't use psychoactive substances to that extent on a daily basis, right? They're anti-addictive or whatever. Very different than cannabis, which you could see kind of a different market strategy because there's so many more uses. It's a daily, it's a maintenance habit. So, the economics of the future potential, very different. But where is the money? Going back to MAPS having this monopoly, there are a lot of companies that are trying to figure out how they can research a substance and bring it to market that will advance the therapeutic needle, when in the face of a pharmaceutical industry that has provided no new options for 40 years, right? That's why the MAPS vets thing is so powerful, right? Because there's nothing for PTSD. We got nothing. And so, and that was part of the reason why it was easy for them to get it through. Fast track. It's like they're not competing against anything. And it's veterans. It's pretty sympathetic population. And so, you know, that also. But there was recently a company that put through some patents in the Oregon setting with developing a drug, and also tried to develop a patent. In the patent was a description of the therapeutic setting and how the therapist was going to put their hand on the left shoulder and not the right, and the chair and the furniture and the lighting and all that. And people went berserk because of bad communication, bad understanding, but this misconception that they were trying to patent the way therapy would be given. Right. So that is also in the psychedelics. It's not going to just be about the drug, the substance, the medicine, but it's also going to be how much preparation do you get? Because, you know,
that goes right back to 1964 and Ken Kesey versus Timothy Leary. You know, one guy wants to have everything in a room controlled with Tibetan freaking drugs and stuff, and the other guy's like, let's just drop this spur of the moment, go out and dance our asses off and see what happens. And I think there's legitimacy in both.
For both. It's just like cannabis. For me, it has to, for it to work, it has to all be available. You have to be able to grow a plant, just like you have to be able to go buy a cannabis pill if that's what you want. Same thing for psychedelics. Not everyone is going to walk around a parking lot and say, anybody got a hit, and open up their mouth and go dance. Other people will never feel, unless they walk into a clinic and they've paid their money. Like, for me to have to take a hallucinogenic in a room with a blindfold, it's like a torture. But other people, that's the only way they would do it. When I first started getting into psychedelics, like hearing that psychedelics were coming back, and I started to do a lot of research, because again, I worked on the initiative here in the district, the ballot initiative to decriminalize. One of the first questions I had was, what's different? What do you mean this is therapeutic? I've used psychedelics a million times. I still am, you know, uptight and cuss when my Zoom doesn't work. What? And I learned all about this idea of setting and preparation and integration and how much of a difference it makes. And I realized there's a lot of value in that. I also think there's a lot of value in picking up some mushrooms in the woods and taking a hike for a couple of hours, you know? So I really see this, the broad spectrum, and I think that it should be available for everyone. And I think that I didn't realize there were so many different points of view. And now I think as I've gotten older, like, you know, everybody's going to need it a little differently. And let's try and figure out a way to make it, to create as much route to access. That's my role. Like, what I'm working on as from a legal standpoint is to not close off any options, and to make sure that the rule, meaning, and you know, first decrim first decrim, you know, they're plants, and then we figure out how we want to build you know, laws around it to protect you. All I know is in 4 years weed was legal, I never got bad, or weed was illegal, I never got bad weed. You know, I never got tainted weed, I never had to worry about fentanyl. It's crazy how the rise of a legal market has generated all these bad actors. And so we have to realize that, you know, legalization and has to come with some guardrails.
Cool. On that note, we have hit our magic number, and I appreciate the time. And thank you for indulging the rabbit holes. I know we like hit maybe 3 questions I sent you, and the rest of the time was free form, but it was really cool and very informative.
Oh, we could talk for hours, I'm sure.